Hey everybody, this is a piece by Werner Bonefeld. It's titled On Postone's Courageous but Unsuccessful Attempt to Banish the Class Antagonism from the Critique of Political Economy. This is from the Historical Materialism Journal. So here we go. Section 1. Postone's important book engages in a, quote, fundamental reinterpretation of Marx's mature critical theory, end quote. One of its objectives is to overcome the theoretical dichotomy of, quote, structure and action, end quote. Postone later admits that the, quote, relationship of structure and action, end quote, has not been fully explained, and that a, quote, more complete account of how value is constituted by people and can be operative, end quote, is required to elucidate this relationship fully. This is a surprising statement at the end of a book devoted to the reconstruction of Marx's critique of political economy. Postone suggests that a fuller understanding of the relationship between structure and action would have to expound more strongly the implications of Marx's analysis, which for him, quote, implies that, although social actors are unaware of the essential structuring forms of capitalist society, there is a systematic relationship between these forms and social action, end quote. An understanding of the dialectic between structure and action would thus require conceptualization of the determining structure of capitalist society. This is indeed Postone's view. In Postone's account, social action is embedded within and derives from abstract social forms. Postone's approach, then, implies that theoretical mysteries do not find those theoretical mysteries rational solution in human practice and in the comprehension of this practice. Instead, Postone sees human social practice to be, quote, structured by and embedded within the social forms of the commodity and capital, end quote. Postone. Critical reconstruction is thus not seen as an attempt at deciphering the human social content of economic forms. Throughout Postone's book, human social practice is conceived as derivative, and thus as a bearer of social and economic functions. Postone's conception of the human being as an agent, actor or agency is symptomatic, and leads him to a sociological reading of social action, whereas efforts at a critical reconstruction of Marx's critique of political economy associated with Backhaus and Reichelt, argue that Marx's work amounts to a reductio ad hominem. Postone proposes what needs to be explained. He presupposes the class-divided human being as a personification or a character mask, that is, as a human attribute of things. According to AI Overview, reductio ad hominem or ad hominem is a type of logical fallacy that occurs when an argument attacks the person making the argument rather than the argument itself. It essentially means, quote, to the person, end quote, in Latin. Instead of addressing the validity of the claim, the focus shifts to undermining the character, motives, or credibility of the individual. I don't know how that applies to Reichelt and Backhaus. Anyway, moving on. Section 2. According to Postone, quote, class conflict is a driving force of historical development in capitalism only because class conflict is structured by and embedded in the social forms of the commodity and capital, end quote. Postone. This view is reminiscent of Joachim Hirsch's contribution to the state debate of the 1970s. As Joachim Hirsch put it, quote, the course of capitalist development is not determined mechanically or by some kind of law of nature. Within the framework of capitalist development's general laws, Capitalist development is determined rather by the actions of the acting subjects and classes, the resulting concrete conditions of crisis, and their political consequences. End quote. Joachim Hirsch. That piece is probably on this channel. This quotation summarizes Postone's position well. As Postone puts it, quote, "The characteristics of capitalist society cannot be grounded in the struggle of producers and appropriators per se." End quote. Postone. Furthermore, quote, "The analysis of value, surplus value, and capitalist social forms cannot be fully grasped in terms of class categories." End quote. Postone. Indeed, Postone is adamant that class struggle is tied to the, quote, "capitalist system." Class struggle is a, quote, "important factor in the spatial and temporal development of capital," end quote, and, quote, "becomes a driving element of the historical development of capitalist society," end quote. Postone. And as such an element, class struggle, quote, "represents capital constituting rather than capital transcending forms of action," end quote. Postone. The idea that class struggle is tied to capital and is constitutive of capital's dynamic is banal. There is no need here to argue at length that Marx conceived of capital as a social relationship of, quote, "man himself and his social relations," end quote. Marx. Postone's notion, however, that class struggle is merely a constructive force for the development of capitalism is an unquestionably useful, that is, consensus-creating and thus peak-making, deceitful publicity. Footnote. The characterization of conflict as a constructive conflict is intrinsic to the notion of a pluralist society, and has been influential in the study of a variety of fields such as industrial relations, theories of parliamentary democracy, and new social movements. The understanding that conflict is endemic in a pluralist society does not mean that conflict should be provoked. It means that rules, procedures, and laws are invoked which regulate conflict, and through which conflict can express itself in constructive forms. A theory of the functionality of conflict is presented, for example, by Koser, 1956, and has been developed within the Marxist framework by Poulantzas, 1973. The charge of a deceitful publicity draws on Kant's insistence in his Disputes of the Faculties that in order to discover the, quote, "true character of the Constitution," end quote, one has to go beyond the, quote, "deceitful publicity," end quote, of the constitutional text and beyond the professions of its mystical proponents. For a discussion, see Agnoli, 2003, originally written 1992. End footnote. Why is it that, quote, "the significance of the category of surplus value cannot be understood fully in terms of exploitation," end quote? The answer seems to lie in Postone's differentiation between social antagonism and social contradiction. Postone argues that they are, quote, "not identical," end quote. Postone. However, this differentiation merely articulates the traditional view according to which society is divided between an objective framework of general determinations and the subjectivity of social antagonisms that is embedded within this framework. Hence Postone's repeated insistence that, quote, "the Marxian notions of class and class struggle acquire their full significance only as a category of an inherently contradictory and dynamic system," end quote. Postone. This dynamic belongs to, quote, "capital," and this would mean that labor is thus a mere mediating force which exists solely within capital, that is, embedded within. And derived from its overarching framework. What, however, is meant by system? Marx's critical question is important here. Quote, "Why does this content, bracket, human social relations, and bracket, take that form, bracket, the form of capital, end bracket," end quote. Marx. This question entails research into the social constitution of economic categories, deciphering the economic categories' human content. Thus, critique would have to demystify the autonomy of value and capital as an objective delusion. The objective delusion is fostered by the capitalist exchange relations themselves. Capitalist exchange relations suggest that rationally acting subjects meet on the market to realize those rationally acting subjects' rational interests, whereas in fact they act as executives in accordance with abstract social laws which they themselves have generated historically and reproduced through their rational behavior, and over which they have no control. Fetishism is real, and at the same time, fetishism hides its social content. Postone, too, sees labor as the central category of Marx's critique. As Postone puts it, quote, "The constituting centrality of labor in capitalism," end quote, explains the, quote, "ultimate ground for the abstract structures of domination, the increasing fragmentation of individual labor and individual existence, and the blind runaway development logic of capitalist society and large-scale organizations that increasingly subsume people," end quote. Postone. Yet, however central, Postone's account rejects, quote, "critical reconstruction," end quote, as the, quote, "return of, quote, a relation of objects to one another," of, quote, "a relation of objects to one another," end quote. That is, of economic categories to, quote, "relations between men," end quote. Labor is merely mediating the abstract logic of capital. As Postone puts it, the structure of capitalist relations of production is constituted by the, quote, "labor-mediated form of social relations," end quote. Postone. What might this mean? On the one hand, Postone argues that capital can, quote, "not exist without value-creating labor," end quote, and thus can not autonomize itself from labor. On the other, Postone argues that capital is a self-grounding and self-moving subject, and thus, quote, "a subject in capital's own right." Therefore, might Postone, therefore, be suggesting that value-creating labor is a mere economic resource? New section, section 3. Postone focuses on labor as, quote, "the constituent source of domination in capitalism," end quote. And Postone argues that, quote, "Marx describes, bracket, the system of social domination," end bracket, as the domination of people by people's own labor," end quote. Postone. This view has much to commend it. Unfortunately, Postone does not develop this view's insights. Were Postone to have done so, Postone would have had to analyze the genesis of this domination and, through it, the social constitution of this domination's objective appearance as an autonomous force. Postone does neither. Postone claims that so-called primitive accumulation is merely a historical precondition for capitalist social relations, and that, once large-scale industry is developed, this precondition is no longer, quote, "structurally central," end quote. Postone. Postone's acceptance, then, of capital as a subject is only logical. Postone argues that this subject has a directional dynamic, is self-grounding and self-moving, and that its movement is, quote, "without limit," end quote. In short, Postone sees the, quote, "capital form of social relations as an alienated abstract moving other, abstract self-moving other, characterized by a constant directional movement with no external goal," end quote. Postone. As a consequence, Postone's reconstruction transforms Marx's program of a, quote, "general critique of the entire system of economic categories," end quote, a critique that seeks to decipher the fetishism of the commodity form on a, quote, "human basis," end quote, into a theory of capital. If, however, the separation of labor from labor's means is the precondition of the capitalist social relations, would this not imply that this separation of labor from its means remains, quote, "structurally central," end quote? What would happen to capitalist reproduction were it not to reproduce the divorce of labor from labor's means, a divorce that constitutes the, quote, "sine qua non of the existence of capital," end quote. Marx. Would labor remain, quote, objectless free labor, end quote, or would the means of production transform into means of emancipation? Postone's transformation of the critique of political economy into a theory of capital separates the genesis of social forms from the social forms constituted existence. Horkheimer's remark that, quote, human beings produce, through their own labor, a reality which increasingly enslaves them, end quote. Horkheimer. This remark is of key importance for the issues raised here. At first sight, the sentence provides a paradox. On the one hand, human beings are the subject of the sentence. Human beings are active and creative. Human beings produce their own reality. Human beings are the essence of the sentence. On the other hand, human beings are merely the object of an enslaved reality. Human beings are reduced to functional actors who are directed by something that stands above human beings, and which merely develops through the human beings' actions. How do we understand human activity, subject and as such, essence of reality, or merely the object of reality? In other words, is human practice merely an innocent bystander or functional actor of a reality which determines social relations, as in Postone, or is human practice a productive power? Horkheimer's remark has a critical meaning. How can one understand the circumstance that human practice exists against human practice's self in seemingly extra-human forms? How, then, is it possible to understand the situation in which human action is constitutive action at the same time as human beings appear to be ruled by already existing abstractions? Horkheimer rightly identified the separation between the genesis of social forms from social forms constituted existence as the blind spot of dogmatic thought. Postone's reconstruction argues against the dogmatic tradition of Marxist thought. Yet, Postone's reconstruction resists the critical understanding of Marx's abstractions as the, quote, constituted conceptuality, end quote, of a class-divided social practice, a social practice that exists within, suffuses and contradicts the things themselves. Postone's social theory assumes the, quote, objective appearance, end quote, of capital as the objective framework of social action, as if this framework were a subjective, objective thing apart. Postone calls this thing, quote, the capital subject, end quote. In short, Postone's approach affirms what needs to be negated. In contrast to Postone, Marx's critique of political economy argues that the positing of the results of human labor as a force over and above the social individual, including both the capitalist and the wage laborer, is founded on the continued separation of labor from labor's means. Quote, the means of production become capital only insofar as the means of production have become separated from labor and confront labor, separated from the labor and confront labor as an independent power, end quote. Marx conceived of capitalist accumulation in terms of the separation of labor from labor's conditions and the concentration of these conditions in the hands of, quote, non-workers, end quote. In fact, Marx argued that this separation, quote, forms, bracket, Bildet, and bracket, the conception, bracket, Begriff, and bracket, of capital, end quote. Marx. The human history of primitive accumulation is thus not only a constitutive presupposition, but also the foundation upon which the constituted existence of capital rests. Primitive accumulation, in short, is, quote, the foundation of capitalist reproduction, end quote. The class struggle, then, that freed master from serf and serf from master is constitutive of the relation between capital and labor. As Clark put it, class struggle is the, quote, logical and historical presupposition of the existence of individual capitalists and workers, end quote, and, quote, the basis on which exploitation, end quote, rests. Were this not so, the understanding of history as a history of class struggle would make little sense. The divorce of labor from labor's means persists within the capital relation as its constitutive prepositing action. Bracket for aussetzendis tun. This end bracket. This quote tun lies at the heart of capitalism's reproduction. The prepositing action of the separation of labor from labor's conditions is not the historical result of capitalism, but capitalism's presupposition, a presupposition which renders capital a social production relation based on the separation of labor's social productive force from labor's conditions, and even more pronounced, confers on these conditions the power of applying labor rather than being controlled by labor. Still, the systematic character of primitive accumulation subsists and suspended, bracket, Aufgeobene, and bracket, form in capitalist social relations. This is because the separation is now posited as the presupposition of capitalist reproduction. It no longer, quote, figures as the condition of its historical emergence, but rather as the presupposition of its fanatical bent of reproducing human relations as relations between commodity owners, that is, as social categories of capitalist production of abstract wealth for the sake of abstract wealth. In short, capitalist, quote, accumulation merely presents a continuous process within primitive accumulation. Accumulation merely presents as a continuous process what in primitive accumulation appears as a distinct historical process, as the process of the emergence of capital, end quote. Marx. The terror of separation, of capitalism's primitive or original beginning, weighs like a nightmare on the social practice of human purposeful activity. The commodified existence of human social practice in form of wage labor confronts its conditions as alien conditions, as conditions of exploitation, as conditions which appear and so exist contradictorily as relations between things. Quote, man is confronted by things. Labor is confronted by labor's own materialized conditions as alien, independent, self-contained subjects, personifications, in short, as someone else's property. And in this form as, quote, employers, end quote, and, quote, commanders, end quote, of labor itself, which they appropriate instead of being appropriated by it. The fact that value, whether value exists as money or as commodities, and in the further development of the conditions of labor, confronts the worker as the property of other people, as independent properties, means simply that they confront him as the property of the non-worker, or at any rate, that, as a capitalist, the worker confronts them, bracket, the conditions of labor, and bracket, not as a worker, but as the owner of value, etc., as the subject in which these things possess their own will, belong to themselves, and are personified as independent forces, end quote. Marx. The, quote, perverted form, end quote, of value presents, in other words, the mode of existence of human purposeful activity in the form of impersonal relations, conferring on the human being the indignity of an existence, bracket, Dasein, end bracket, as a personification of things. Thus, concerning the capital-labor relation, bracket, quote, the worker produces himself as labor capacity, as well as the capital confronting him, end quote. At the same time, quote, the capitalist reproduces himself as capital, as well as the living labor capacity confronting him, end quote. Marx. Footnote. In the English translation, in the German verrückte form is translated as, quote, absurd form, end quote. The translation is, quote, absurd, end quote. In German, quote, verrückt, end quote, has two meanings. Verrückt, bracket, mad or crazy, end bracket, and verrückt, bracket, displaced, end bracket. Thus the notion of, quote, perverted forms, end quote, means that these forms are both mad and displaced. In other words, they are the modes of existence of social practice in which, quote, subject and object do not statically oppose each other, but rather are caught up in a, quote, ongoing process, end quote, of the, quote, inversion of the subjectivity into objectivity and vice versa. In the following, quote, perversion or, quote, perverted will be used in this double sense. End footnote. Now, where am I? Quote, each reproduces itself by reproducing the other, its negation. The capitalist produces labor as alien, labor produces the product as alien, end quote. Marx. In short, quote, the relation of every capitalist to that capitalist's own workers is the relationship as such of capital and labor, the essential relationship. The relation of every capitalist to that capitalist's own workers is the relationship as such of capital and labor, the essential relationship, end quote. Marx. Postone's reconstruction fails to conceptualize his essential relationship, that is, the antagonism between capital and labor. Postone's account merely recognizes constituted character masks. Postone conceives of human social, quote, action as something that is embedded within the framework of abstract social forms. This renders, quote, social action as mere attribute of things. As a consequence, Postone conceives of class struggle merely as a struggle between personifications or character masks, that is, between the subjective agents of a, quote, enchanted, perverted, topsy-turvy world in which Monsieur le Capital and Madame le Terre do their ghost-walking as social characters and at the same time directly as mere things, end quote. Marx. In contrast to Postone's view, this section has argued that Marx's critique amounts to a determinate negation of the constituted forms of capital as, quote, relations between humans, end quote. Adorno rightly saw this, quote, reductio ad hominem, end quote, as the essential core of Marx's critique of political economy. It deciphers the, quote, puzzling forms, end quote, of value as forms, quote, assumed by social relations between man and man, end quote, and reveals their social constitution in the peculiar social character of labor that, quote, becomes productive only by producing its opposite, end quote, i.e. capital. In short, the objective appearance of capital hides, quote, capital's genesis, end quote, and thus makes capital's human content invisible. The critique of political economy is thus subversive. The critique of political economy's task is to make visible the hidden human content of economic categories so that humans gain consciousness of themselves as the producers of their own forsaken world. Quote, the constitution of the world occurs behind the backs of the individuals, yet it is their work, end quote. Marx. That's not Marx, excuse me. Marcuse. The reified world of capital is thus not only dependent on labor as the substance of value. The reified world of capital is also always dependent on the reproduction of labor as, quote, objectless free labor, end quote. Marx. And however much capital appears to have autonomized capital's self from human social relations, capital remains a form of human social practice. In short, a reconstruction of Marx's work that does not decipher the human content of economic forms, and that therefore does not comprehend the forms of capital as perverted forms of social human practice, is condemned to conceive the bourgeois world only in the form of an objective subjective thing. Postone's notion of labor as a mediating force and of class struggle as a means of capitalist development is therefore apt. New section. Section 4. Postone justifies the thrust of his reconstruction by arguing that Marx shifted his position, quote, from a theory of social relations understood essentially in terms of class relations to a theory of forms of social mediation expressed by categories such as value and capital, end quote. Postone. These categories cannot be grounded in the relations of exploitation. Quote, the categories of value and surplus value refer to objectified forms of social mediation and cannot be understood solely in terms of class relations of exploitation, end quote. And according to Postone, therefore, Marx shifted from a class analysis to an examination of capital as, quote, the historical subject, end quote. Postone. This subject, quote, consists of objectified relations, the subjective objective categorial forms characteristic of capitalism, whose, quote, substance is abstract labor, that is, the specific character of labor as a socially mediating activity in capitalism. Marx's subject, like Hegel's then, is abstract and cannot be identified with any social actors, end quote. Postone. It is a, quote, total subject, end quote. Postone. The historical subject, quote, is the alienated structure of social mediation that constitutes the capitalist formation, end quote. Postone. Instead, then, of a critique of totality, Postone affirms that, quote, capital is, quote, self-valorizing value, end quote, end quote. Postone. Postone thus seems indifferent to the fact that Marx actually criticizes the conception of capital as self-valorizing value as the, quote, fetishism of capital, end quote. The constitutive fetish of capital does indeed render its character as a social relationship, quote, invisible, end quote. Postone. Yet critical social theory is not theology. Its task is not to derive social relations from the invisible, but rather to derive the, quote, metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties from the self-contradictory, end quote, from the self-contradictory social relations themselves. The task then is, quote, to develop from the actual relations of life the corresponding celestial forms of these relations, end quote. Marx. Marx's critique of fetishism focused on the, quote, relationships amongst the things themselves, end quote, where, quote, all productive power of labor is projected as powers of capital, the same as all forms of value are projected as forms of money, end quote. Marx. All these projections, externalizations, and fetish forms hide the fact that they are, quote, the product of a social relation, not the product of a mere thing, end quote. Marx. Sorry, I feel like I fucked up some of the quotations there. Marx's critique of fetishism focuses on the, quote, relationships among the things themselves, end quote, where, quote, all productive power of labor is projected as capital, so he's projected as powers of capital, the same as all forms of value are projected as forms of money, end quote. Marx. All these projections, externalizations, and fetish forms hide the fact that they are the, quote, product of a social relation, not the product of a mere thing, end quote. Marx. Against political economy's formidable attempt to theorize the invisible, Marx argues that each, quote, form, or even the most simple forms such as, for example, the commodity, quote, is already an inversion and causes relations between people to appear as relations between things, end quote. Or more emphatically, each form is a, quote, perverted form, end quote. Marx. The most developed perversion, the constituted fetish of capitalist society, is the relationship of capital to capital's self, of a thing to itself. Marx's program amounts thus to a, quote, radical critique, end quote, of the hypothetical subject of political economy, as we shall see below. Postone's conception of capital as a, quote, authentic subject, end quote, renders the critique of capital as a definite social relationship impossible, unless, of course, the subject relates to the subject self as if it were a person apart. This seems indeed to be his position. Postone's theory of capital presupposes that capital reigns supreme. The historical subject has to reign supreme, otherwise the historical subject's determination as the historical subject would make little sense. However, and in contrast to Postone, Marx's conception of capital as the subject posits no more than the theoretical hypothesis of political economy. If, however, capital really is the subject, then we are dealing with the, quote, invisible, and social theory would reveal social theory's self as a secularized theology of the capital thing as an extra-mundane subject. Yet, however perverted and reified, capital is a human form of existence. As indicated by Schmidt, Marx's work is foremost characterized by the primacy of, quote, practice, and that Marx's critique amounts to a conceptualized praxis, bracket, begriffene praxis, end bracket, that is, a theoretical understanding of the totality of human action, which constitutes, suffuses, and contradicts the perverted world of capital. See the piece on here by, I can't remember the person's name. It's like Herman Kosiba. Something like that. But it's an introduction to the work of, why can't I think of his name now? Alfred Schmidt. Anyway. Postone is right to argue that wage labor is not an antagonistic subject. The standpoint of capital and wage labor is the same. In its simple capacity, labor is purposive, productive activity. This activity exists against itself as a value-creating, abstract wealth-producing commodity, wage labor. Purposeful human social practice exists against itself as a mere economic resource. Human social practice exists, then, through the constituted forms of capital, quote, in itself, end quote, as relations between things, whose constituted form is the separation of human social practice from human social practice's conditions, and, quote, for itself, end quote, because human social relations subsist in and through the relations between things, a world of things that is reproduced by, quote, by, quote, active humanity, end quote, and through its class-divided social practice. It follows that human social practice subsists also, quote, against itself, end quote, as, on the one hand, a perverted social category, and, on the other, as a power that makes history and is thus capable of leaving behind its own perverted existence. New section, section 5. Postone's characterization of capital as the, quote, historical subject, end quote, accords to labor the function of social mediation. Labor mediates the, quote, relations among people as well as relations between people and nature, end quote. Postone. Footnote. Postone's conception of, quote, mediation is similar to Habermas's, quote, media, itself derived from Parsons. For an account of Marx's concept of, quote, mediation, see Richard Gunn, 1987, and Bonefeld, 1987. In Marx, the term, quote, mediation is not employed as a means of theorizing the relationship between, quote, structure and action, end quote. Rather, it is, quote, form constitutive, end quote, mediation. Quote, is generally the way in which real contradictions are reconciled, end quote. Allowing antagonistic relations, quote, to exist side by side, end quote, without sweeping away the antagonism. Mediation thus gives, quote, social form, end quote, to antagonistic relations, and these do not exist external to these forms, but constitute and subsist in and through these forms. End footnote. Postone sees his contribution as a critique not of capital but of labor. Postone argues that the core antagonism of capitalist society is contained in labor itself. Postone emphasizes the dual character of labor as abstract labor and concrete labor, and grounds the exchange value and use value dimension of the commodity form in labor's dual character. In sum, Postone argues that, quote, labor is separated from labor's purpose and becomes a means toward a goal given by the alienated structures constituted by, parenthesis, abstract, and parenthesis, labor itself, end quote. I don't know if that parenthesis is from Postone himself or from Bonefeld. I'm going to assume it's from Bonefeld, because Bonefeld usually just says straight up labor. Capital, then, quote, refers to a contradictory and dynamic structure of alienated social relations constituted by labor, end quote. According to Postone, quote, the function of labor as a socially mediating activity is what, bracket, Marx, end bracket, terms, quote, abstract labor, end quote, ... What makes labor general in capitalism is not simply the truism that it is the common denominator of all various specific sorts of labor. Rather, what makes labor general in capitalism is the social function of labor. Rather, it is the social function of labor which makes it general. As a socially mediating activity, labor is abstracted from the specificity of labor's product, hence from the specificity of its own concrete form, end quote. Postone. Abstract labor renders capitalist commodity production social, and thus makes it possible for the commodity to exist in a social context. The contradiction, then, is not between capital and labor, but rather between abstract labor and concrete labor, between exchange value and use value. Both concrete labor and abstract labor, exchange value and use value, are constitutive of the commodity form, leading to a conception of a contradictorily constituted social world. He thus juxtaposes, quote, the value dimension of the forms, parenthesis, abstract labor, value, abstract time, end parenthesis, and their use value dimension, parenthesis, concrete labor, material wealth, concrete time, end parenthesis, end quote. Postone. In this way, then, the fact that capital depends on the exploitation of labor is not unimportant. However, much more important is the contradictory relationship between use value and exchange value, between abstract labor and concrete labor. As Rakovitz notes, Postone's conception of labor as estranged labor leads to the idea that the alienated structures of capital are constituted by abstract labor itself. Footnote, see Rakovitz, 2000. It is therefore only logical that Postone sees emancipatory potential in the use value dimension of the commodity form. As Postone sees it, quote, The potential of the use-value dimension, no longer contained and shaped by the value dimension, could be used reflexively to transform the material form of production, end quote. Postone. Postone discusses this insight in terms of the crisis-ridden tension between social, quote, wealth and capitalist, quote, value. Postone does not develop this insight. This is unfortunate because its development might well have opened Postone's interpretation to the political economy of labor, a political economy of struggle for human cooperation, solidarity, dignity, and the democratic organization of social time. The time of class struggle entails a different conception of time, to which holds that time is money. Since, however, class struggle is conceived as capital reproducing, Postone's notion that use value has to be emancipated from exchange value remains without social foundation. What, in other words, is the, quote, social ground, end quote, upon which Postone's standard of critique rests? Postone recognizes that the, quote, problem for social theory of the standards of critique is, of course, difficult, end quote. And Postone's study does not deal with the, quote, question of the standards by which that which exists can be criticized, end quote. Postone. Is it really possible to supply a critique of capital or a critique of labor without a proper understanding of the standard of critique? In the introduction to his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, Marx rejects the idea of a different state form as a means for achieving a more just society by saying, quote, poor dogs, they want to treat you like human beings, end quote. Does Marx here indicate the standard of critique, or is it better, quote, grounded in the insight that even the, quote, simplest form, the commodity, for example, is already an inversion, end quote, and that is a perverted form, question mark. Backhaus, where am I? New section, section 6. I agree with Postone that many of the, quote, explicit themes and concepts of the early writings, parenthesis, such as the critique of alienation, the concern with the possibility of forms of human activity not defined narrowly in terms of work, play, or leisure, and the theme of the relations between men and women, in parenthesis, remain central, if implicit, in Marx's later works, end quote. Backhaus has shown that Marx's critique of political economy is fundamentally a critique of social constitution and therewith human social constitution in perverted forms. According to Backhaus, the value form is conceptualized as a perverted form of human practice, whose existence appears necessarily as a thing in itself as if it were a power unto itself. This is because social labor is constituted in such a way that it has no consciousness of itself, a consciousness that, instead, appears to be the property of the product of human purposeful activity, the life of the commodity. In order, then, to comprehend the social construction of class struggle, of capital and wage labor, one has to investigate the critical intention of Marx's argument that he deals in capital, Marx's Capital, the book, with workers and capitalists only as, quote, personifications of economic categories, end quote. Marx. The critical dimension of Marx's critique of political economy is the return of the world of things to the world of things human basis. Marx announced this reduction when he argued that critique amounts to a, quote, ruthless criticism of all that exists. Ruthless criticism of all that exists. Ruthless both in the sense of not being afraid of the results it arrives at, and at the sense of being just a little afraid of conflict with the powers that be, end quote. Marx wanted neither to construct nor affirm. Postone is therefore correct when he argues that Marx wanted primarily to negate. However, Marx does not negate for the sake of negation. Such endeavor is without standard and merely leads to the reconciliation with existing relations of power, the so-called negation of the negation. What then might the standard of critique be? critique, Marx argued, has to demonstrate ad hominem, and it demonstrates ad hominem as soon as it becomes radical. Quote, to be radical is to grasp the root of the matter, but for man, the root is man himself, end quote, Marx. And, quote, man is the highest being for man. Man is the highest being for man, end quote, Marx. And all relations, quote, in which man is debased, enslaved, forsaken, despicable being, end quote, have to be overthrown. The standard of critique is the human being's dignity and possibilities. Footnote, on Marx's, quote, mature ad hominem critique of capital, see Backhaus 2004. End footnote. There is no doubt that society's laws of motion abstract, quote, from its individual subjects, degrading its individual subjects to mere executors, mere partners in social wealth and social struggles. The debasement was as real as the fact that, on the other hand, there would be nothing without individuals and their spontaneities. End quote. Adorno. Reification, then, quote, finds reification's limitation in reified man, bracket Mensch, and bracket, end quote, Marx. And that is, the reality in which the social individual moves day in, day out, has no invariant character. The reality in which the social individual moves day in and day out is not something which exists independently from capital M, man. Horkheimer's characterization of Marx's critique of political economy as a, quote, judgment on existence, end quote, Horkheimer, expresses the same fundamental idea. From this perspective, the so-called autonomization, bracket, Verselbständigung, end bracket, of capital stands for the autonomization of the relations of production which, although rendering the human being invisible, exist in and through and rests on human social practice in human social practice's entirety. However, much capital appears to have autonomized capital's self. Capital presupposes human social relations as capital's substance. In sum, the critique of capital has to show the human content, however perverted and debased, of the capitalist constitution of social existence. Postone argues, rightly, that Marx's critique amounts to a theory of social constitution. However, Postone discusses social constitution merely in terms of the objective framework within which human social practice unfolds. The existence of sellers and buyers on the labor market presupposes, as Reichelt argues, the constitution of capitalist society, and thus the class antagonism between capital and labor, an antagonism where the means of production are posited as capital, and where human productive power is rendered a laboring commodity, and, as such, an exploitable resource. Where am I? Sorry, I lost my spot. In capitalist society, individuals produce in and for society as social individuals. Yet at the same time, individuals' production appears as a mere means of objectifying those individuals' individuality as personifications of things. Thus, individuals' existence as private persons in a social context entails that the social individual subsists as an individualized individual whose social existence appears to derive from the relations between the things themselves. In short, human social practice subsists through fetishized forms, as if those fetishized forms were a person apart. Marx's work focuses on forms, and at first on forms of consciousness, parentheses, such as religion and law, in parentheses, and then later on the forms of political economy. For Marx, the focus on forms was identical with the critique of the inverted forms of social existence, an existence constituted by human social practice. All these forms obtain as inverted forms of a, quote, community that is external to the individuals, and from which they must emancipate themselves in order ever to be able to interact with one another, quote, as individuals, end quote. The central idea is presented most emphatically in the German ideology, quote, the reality, bracket, das Beste Ende, and bracket, that communism creates is precisely the real, bracket, Wirkliche, and bracket, basis for rendering it impossible that any reality should exist independently of individuals, insofar as this reality is not only a product of the preceding intercourse of the individuals themselves, end quote. It is thus a matter of deciphering the appearance, bracket, Schein, and bracket, of independence that this, quote, surrogate of community, end quote, posits, and then of abolishing it so as to permit human beings to enter into relationship with one another, not as personifications of economic categories, but as social individuals, not as categories of antagonistic class interests, but as, quote, communist individuals, end quote. Marx. Marcuse. I keep leaving out Marcuse. Section 7. The human being is inseparable. That is, the human being cannot be separated unless through force and violence into, for example, an economic factor of production and, quite distinct, a human actor endowed with equal rights. In bourgeois society, however, this separation is real in practice. The separation of the human being from the means of production and the constituted existence of these as capital underlies the separation between the political and the economic. The, quote, logic of separation, end quote, is the, quote, real generation process of capital, end quote. And, quote, the whole system of capitalist production is based on the fact that the workman sells his labor power as a commodity, end quote. Marx. This separation of the laborer from her means is constitutive of the alienated existence of labor as a wage-laboring commodity. Any social theory which presupposes human social practice as an attribute of things, that is, as acting human agents, amounts to an affirmative theory of separation. As a consequence, such social theory can do no other but to presuppose capital as a self-valorizing value, unless as a subject. This, then, is the basis upon which Postone seeks to analyze the relationship of structure and action. Yet the human being is inseparable, while in other words, quote, the subdivision of labor is the assassination of the people, end quote. Urquhart quoted in Marx. The subdivision of labor consolidates the, quote, original, end quote, separation of labor from labor's conditions through further and further fragmentation of the social labor process. Yet, however fragmented social labor is, divided and subdivided, human cooperation remains, quote, the fundamental form of the capitalist mode of production, end quote. Without human, end quote, Marx. Without human cooperation, there would be neither production nor exchange. This cooperation exists against this cooperation's self in the commodity form that integrates the, quote, assassination of a people, end quote, with the respectful forms of bourgeois relations of exchange, equality, freedom, and liberty. The understanding of, quote, class hinges on the conception of social relations. In Postone's work, the social relations stand removed from the class relations. Postone conceives of the working class as an economically constituted class. Class, Postone argues, is, quote, a relational category. Classes are determined in relation to other classes, end quote. Postone. Although his book seeks to reconstruct Marx's critique of political economy as a critical social theory, class relations are nevertheless perceived in economic terms. Class is seen as a relationship between producing and appropriating social groups. In addition to this, quote, economic relationship, quote, other social strata and groupings, end quote, exist who are, quote, organized around religious, ethnic, national, or gender issues. End quote. Postone. This view is reminiscent of Giddens' idea that distinct social interests and conflicts correspond with specific structure of relations, such as, quote, economic relations, end quote. Parenthesis, characterized by, quote, wage-labor conflict, end quote, end parenthesis. Quote, ecological relations, end quote. Parenthesis, characterized by, quote, ecological conflict, end quote, end parenthesis. Quote, ethnic relations, end quote. Parenthesis, characterized by, quote, racism, end quote, end parenthesis. Quote, gender relations, end quote. Parenthesis, characterized by patriarchy and sexism, end parenthesis, and so on. However, even if we accept that there are many distinct social groupings in society, should there not be, at least paraphrasing Bellafiore, the acknowledgement that individuals accept the mutilations of themselves during a part of the day are marked throughout the whole of their daily activity. It's the Bellafiore here is Bellofiori. I don't know if that's a typo or not, if it's referring to Bellafiore as in Riccardo Bellafiore or someone else. There is no reason to assume why this should be different from the whole of society. Besides, the categorization of forms of social conflict according to distinct conflict-generating social structures does not inquire into the social constitution of these structures. Instead, it presupposes the explanandum in the explanation. Postone's treatment of, quote, class, unquote, in terms of a theory of social groupings is disturbing but hardly surprising. As Postone sees it, quote, the analysis of value, surplus value, and capital as social forms cannot be fully grasped in terms of class categories, end quote. Postone. And a Marxist analysis that does just that commits a, quote, serious sociological reduction of the Marxian critique, end quote. Footnote. There is much that has to be said in support of Postone's view that the traditional analysis of class is indeed characterized by a sociological reduction, by sociological reductions, and Postone's own theory of social groupings might well be criticized in these terms. On the notion of class as a critical category, see Gunn, 1987, and Bonefeld, 2002. End footnote. This is because, quote, overt and direct social relations do continue to exist, but capitalist society is ultimately structured by a new, underlying level of social interrelatedness, which cannot be grasped adequately in terms of the overtly social relations among people or groups, including classes. The Marxian theory does, of course, include an analysis of class exploitation and domination, but it goes beyond investigating the unequal distribution of wealth and power within capitalism to grasp the very nature of its social fabric, its peculiar form of wealth, and its intrinsic form of domination, end quote. Postone. Are class relations really just an expression of the unequal distribution of wealth and power? Equally disturbing is Postone's view that the struggle for the shortening of the working day is, quote, structurally intrinsic to capitalism, end quote, and hence, quote, an important constitutive element of the dynamic of that system, end quote. Postone: it undoubtedly is, yet the struggle for the shortening of the working week is also a struggle of over the organization of socially necessary labor to meet human needs. The democratic organization of social time by the associated producers themselves and the reduction of time to an abstract measure of wealth belong to two different worlds. However important then this struggle has been for the development of capital, quote, the shortening of the working day is the basic prerequisite, end quote, for human emancipation. However much labor time was needed in 2003 to produce the same amount of commodities that was produced in 1993, 20%, 40%, 50%, whatever the percentage might be, what is certain is that labor time has not decreased. It has increased. At the same time, we witness ever more vicious conquest of atoms of additional labor time through means of labor flexibilization and deregulation. Senate has rightly argued that this conquest corrodes the character. This conquest corrodes the character. Is resistance to this conquest really just constitutive to the development of capitalism? Besides, strike action, refusal to comply, and resistance take courage. Do workers strike as wage-laboring personifications of variable capital, or do they strike because they have character? Yet there is only one world, a world of class antagonism, between the political economy of labor and the political economy of capital. This is the site of class antagonism and class struggle. And in order to understand these things, one has to be within them. In short, quote, already the simple forms of exchange value and of money latently contain the opposition between labor and capital, end quote. Marx. Postone's insight that capital, quote, refers to a contradictory and dynamic structure of alienated social relations constituted by labor, end quote, Postone, is important. If, however, quote, one speaks of labor, then one is dealing immediately with man himself. The new positing of the question is already the question's solution, end quote. Marx. Postone's substitution of the critique of capital with a theory of capital and a critique of labor belies this insight. The theoretical and practical consequences are formidable. And that's the end of the piece. Some of the citations, I'll read through them. Theodor Adorno, Negative Dialectics. Johannes Agnoli's article, Destruction as the Determination of the Scholar in Miserable Times. Johannes Agnoli, The State, the Market, and the End of History. Backhaus, Between Philosophy and Science, Marxian Social Economy as Critical Theory. Hans-Georg Backhaus, Der Dialektik der Wertform. Riccardo Bellifiore, Lavori and Corso. Werner Bonefeld, 1987, Marxism and the Concept of Mediation. Bonefeld, 1995, Capital as Subject and the Existence of Labor. Bonefeld, 2000, Die Betroffenheit und die Vernunft der Kritik. In Kritik der Politik, edited by Joachim Brun. Bonefeld, 2001, Human Dignity, Social Form and Critique. Bonefeld, 2002, Capital, Labor, and Primitive Accumulation, on Class and Constitution. Bonefeld, 2004, Bemerkungen zur Kritik der Voraussetzungen. Bonefeld, Werner Bonefeld, and Cosmos, Psychopetus, 2000, Politics of Change. Simon Clark,
1982, Marx, Marginalism and Modern Sociology. Clark, Introduction to the State Debate, edited by Simon Clark. Alfred Lewis Kosar, The Functions of Social Conflict, 1956. Anthony Giddens, 1990, The Consequences of Modernity. Richard Gunn, 1987, Notes on Quote Class. Richard Gunn, 1987, Marxism in Mediation. Joachim Hirsch, The State Apparatus and Social Reproduction in State and Capital. That should be on this channel. Herbert Marcuse, 1963, Reason and Revolution. Herbert Marcuse, Philosophy and Critical Theory. The usual suspects from Marx. There's a bunch of things in German. Some pieces from Oscar Necht, Wolfgang Port. I think Wolfgang Port is dead now, but he would have been 80, I think, this month. Nikos Poulantzas, 1973, Political Power and Social Classes. Psychopetus, Dialectical Theory, Problems of Reconstruction. Cosmos Psychopetus, 2000, New Social Thought. A book in 2000 from Nadja Rakowitz in German, Einfache Warenproduktion. Helmut Reichelt, Jürgen Habermas, Reconstruction of Historical Materialism. I believe that's on this channel. Alfred Schmidt, 1974, Praxis, published in Gesellschaft Beiträge zur Marxischen Theorie. And Richard Sennett, 1979, The Corrosion of Character. That's the end. Thanks for listening.